couple of us around, we're all a part of Junoon. But before Naresh starts, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes telling you a little bit about what this program is about and what we Naresh here. So as Junoon, the work we do is about building platforms and connect between artists and audiences, and not just in the traditional way that you're going into an auditorium or you're going into a gallery. Really bringing it out in new spaces that are part of our lives, whether it's our schools or places we work, just where we live, in our cities. And we do a variety of work across this in schools, in corporates, and that's all on our website. But as we were doing this work, through this journey, one of our discoveries was that there are incredible stories just that artists have. And these are stories about what makes them the artists, what makes them the creative people. Sometimes it's about, how they create, right? Sometimes it's about like what made them do. What was it that was the kira or the junoon that drove them in a particular direction? And we had the privilege of, hanging around these people and hearing these stories. And they've all been fantastic. And of course their craft is incredible, but these journeys are incredible to us as well. And that was the seed of this particular program. So Mumbai Local is just a way of getting people in the city together, like all of us are here, and to share those stories. To share those stories, to have a conversation, to have a chat about those stories, to spend a happy afternoon, to have that space in the city to be able to do that. This program is about 3 months old. We've done 12 sessions in 4 venues around the city. This is the 12th session actually. And what's been incredible is that they're regular. We want this to become a habit in people's lives. They come, they have this space. It's really a program that's been growing and getting stronger each time we do. Also, the nature of this program is such that it's really a community program. It's a collaborative program. So we are in 4 venues currently. We want to grow it to 15 venues. And in the 4 venues that we are, our venues are our partners. So this is, they contribute to this program by giving us the space to help us make this happen. Our artists are our partners. They come here, they take their time, they come share all these incredible stories. And we are very demanding. So we're not happy just demanding of our artists and our venues. So now we're demanding of our audiences. Saying to all who are here, that come and be a part of this program. Right? Come and experience it. If you like what you see today, come back. Bring a friend. Tweet about it. Put it on Facebook. And if you feel enthusiastic enough to do even more, then meet one of us and we can tell you about how you can volunteer, how you can contribute, money, otherwise. But really come and be a part of this. This is just a way for all of us to connect and make this happen for us. So that's what this program is about. Really, I'm so good at my first time. I practice and practice. But thank you. But yeah, so that's what the program is about. And Naresh is our artist. Now you're artist now. Now you're not sleeping in the artist. You are creative time. And he's done lots of amazing things, but for me, recently, it's been, I just read a book. Because you gave it to us from all. So we get many copies in the office, and it was incredible because it made me fall in love with Bobby again. Yes, and
Australia, it's a big complaint, it's a rant.
It is a rant, but it takes a little bit melody, but it still made me fall in love with it. And then he's just got this incredible online magazine, which I will do. Again and again, and he claims it doesn't let me sleep in the afternoon, but for all that lack of sleep, it's really amazing stuff. So,
thanks. Well, thanks for coming. I'm not an artist, I'm a journalist. I tell other people's stories. I tell them badly. I'm unable to speak extempore, so if you will excuse me, I'm going to read from my notes. And at the end of that, we can have a discussion.
Every 5 minutes, it's okay.
5 minutes. So you're going to ring a bell every 5 minutes. So on my 30th birthday, which as you can tell from the way, was a very, very long time ago, my cousin from America decided that it was finally time to strip me of my innocence. So he bought me a packet of Hostess Twinkies, and many of you here will know what I'm talking about. We've all seen this advertised in the Richie Rich and Hot Stuff comics that were the staples of our Indian childhoods. And I know very few Indians of our class and of my age who did not grow up fantasizing about the snack that was described as delicious golden sponge cake with a yummy cream filling. Almost before I had taken my first bite, my cousin was guffawing loudly. It isn't very pretty experiencing the dreams of your youth turned to dust. And if anybody has actually eaten a Hostess Twinkie, that's exactly what they taste like. Dust or perhaps cardboard. But whatever the hell they taste like, they sure as hell don't warrant obsessing about them for 30 years. I was reminded about that a little while ago when I attended a conference at which the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie appeared by video link. She said that when she wrote her first stories, they were filled with children drinking ginger beer, a beverage that she never actually tasted, but which she felt compelled to have her characters drink copious amounts of the stuff, because they actually bubbled through the pages of the Enid Blyton novels that were the staple of her Nigerian childhood, just like they were the staple of many of our Indian childhoods. And Adichie went on to point out that her ginger beer motifs, like my dreams of Hostess Twinkies, emphasized how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of stories, especially in the face of what she calls the single story. The story that purports to be the definitive account of an event or process, but which leaves very little room for nuance or diversity. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete, she said. They make one story become the only story. She concluded by appealing for forums that encourage many people to tell their stories. All kinds of stories, essentially pleading for narratives that have room for both Hostess Twinkies and for gulab jamuns. Stories matter, Adichie said. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. That's powerful advice, and I think I was struck by it because Chimamanda Adichie managed to articulate very eloquently the approach I've tried to adopt in my journalism, as I've written about cities, especially about Bombay, for the last 2 decades. It's slightly longer, but I'm not really that old. As reporters, especially on daily or weekly deadlines, we're often left with the frustration of being able to cover only a single facet of a story, the single facet of a story to which we are assigned, thereby running the risk of narrowing or distorting the reader's perspective on any issue. So it's a great luxury to occasionally be able to pull back, to take the long view. Of course, on the face of it, the very suggestion that a reporter can claim to tell a story about an entity as vast as a city seems quite presumptuous. The very characteristics of a city, its scale and its diversity, would seem to render futile any attempt to impose grand themes upon it. And yet, as many of us here know, the specific geographical and historical and administrative circumstances under which cities exist give each urban agglomeration a unique personality. We often talk about the qualities of cities in relationship to each other, how Pune perhaps is more happening than Bangalore, or why the carnival in Rio is more lively than the one in the port of Spain. Like so many other reporters, I've tried to sketch out these meta-narratives by seeking out voices that aren't in the center of these stories, hoping that the sum of its few parts will cohere into a compelling whole. In this presentation, I'm going to offer a kaleidoscope of stray ideas and random thoughts I've had while writing about cities. Like the ungainliness of Bombay, where I've done the bulk of my reporting, this presentation will dart through many different registers, So I'll beg your patience a little to sort of come along with me. As all reporters know, the pressure to create self-contained narratives that I need, there's a very immense pressure to do this. And that became amply clear to me in my first week as a reporter with the Times of India's Bombay edition in 1992. 6 days after I started work as a reporter, a mosque in Ayodhya was demolished by a mob. All hell broke loose in Bombay, a city that until then we'd been given to believe was India's most secular, cosmopolitan metropolis. The violence didn't die down for 8 weeks, and it brought to the surface many problems we hadn't been aware of until then. Every evening, the police commissioner would give a press conference at his office at VT, at which he would recite a list of statistics of arson and mob murders, with only perfunctory details about the circumstances of each event. In his view, this was a mere law and order problem that had been provoked by what the authorities would describe every day as enmity between religious groups. But to reporters wandering the streets and going back in the months later with the benefit of hindsight, other factors became apparent. 1992, you will remember, was the year after which Manmohan Singh had formulated his structural adjustment policies, what we now call liberalization. And Bombay, the once industrial capital of the country, was rapidly losing manufacturing jobs, especially in the textile mills. And this had created a large struggling pool of unemployed people. In parallel, the economy was being transformed and being guided in a more speculative direction, with real estate becoming a vital part of this new world. The land mafia, it turned out, was becoming increasingly aware of these new possibilities and was fast drawing into its ranks for both politicians and bureaucrats who would help them fulfill and craft this new vision. If you took a close look at the patterns and targets of some of this so-called religious enmity that was being whipped up during the riots, it was being clear that these religious divisions were actually being whipped up by gangs to lead attacks on municipal offices in some places to destroy sensitive land records, so that and that in other places slums in affluent areas were being set afire so that they could eventually be destroyed by expensive real estate developments. And as I go through Bombay now, that's so clear to me. Slums in Tardeo that were destroyed during the riots and now suddenly have been replaced by expensive gated communities. About 900 people died in those riots. This is a scene from them. Some of you all will have been too young to remember that time. Many of you all, people in the chairs at the back, are not. The majority of these victims, especially in the first burst of violence after the demolition of the Babri Masjid on December 6, 1992, were Muslims who had been shot dead by the police. As you may recall, these riots, I'm going to clear up. This picture was actually taken on Shaukat Ali Road. I was there when many of these pictures were taken, and each time I see them, they sort of bring back great horror to me. But the riots, as you may recall, were followed by a series of bomb blasts that rattled down the spine of Bombay 2 months later, on the afternoon of March 12, 1993. So we had the anniversary of the bomb blast not so long ago. These were India's first modern terrorist attacks, and they left 257 people dead that day. It was apparent that the people who planned these attacks had drawn on the frustration of the riot victims, who the authorities only a few months ago had left to the mercy of the mobs. But almost immediately, the stories of these riot victims were superseded by the much more dramatic and much more globally saleable stories of terrorist victims. The selective manner in which the state chooses to dispense justice also became eminently apparent at that time. The riots killed 3 times the number of people who were killed in the bomb blast, but the investigation into the violence was handed over to a commission of inquiry that could only recommend action against the perpetrators of the violence, but could not pronounce a legally binding decision. So there was the Sri Krishna Commission that heard everything, but it couldn't recommend, even after it identified who was responsible for the riots, it couldn't recommend action or jail for these people. The bomb blasts, on the other hand, were immediately handed over to a high-powered police team which arrested hundreds of people. A special court was set up to try these cases, and 100 accused people were eventually convicted, and they're in jail. Some of them have been handed the death sentence. During that time, less than a dozen people have actually been convicted for the riots that precipitated these blasts. Since that call and response violence of the early 1990s, Bombay has been hit by more than 10 terrorist attacks, and many of you all have experienced them and have lived through that. But because the circumstances of their first attack have been subsumed into an incomplete narrative, we're left baffled with each new outbreak of violence. Bombay, in the shorthand of the instant pundit, is an easy terror target of evil people who are jealous of our conspicuous cosmopolitanism and our economic success. Very few people want to listen to or acknowledge the profound sense of injustice that many of Bombay's Muslims live with. A sense of injustice that, in the hands of fundamentalists, is easily manipulated to set off more violence. Our desire to cling to ourselves, to cling to a single story of ourselves as victims of a global terrorist conspiracy, and our failure to remember the messy stories of 1992, 1993, prevents us from understanding our city's present situation. But recalling this untidy past, even if it isn't very far away, isn't thought to be desirable. Over the past few years, every time the riots anniversaries roll around, I've tried to interest various newspapers and magazines and letting me do articles about to show how that period of violence continues to influence what's happening in Bombay now. In all sorts of ways, we've had ghettoization of Bombay on religious lines, among other things, which is so evident right down the road here in Kurla. But most often I'm told, quite gently and politely, that the events of the last 2 decades are completely immaterial. The standard explanation I'm given is that readers must not be burdened with irrelevancies if they are to move on with their lives. That said, I'm going to change track here now and alter the tone a little to talk about the compulsions I faced in having to boil down the city into a single narrative, or specifically a single icon. This happened at our editorial meetings almost every fortnight for the 6 years that I edited Time Out Mumbai, a magazine that tried to throw light on the city's life by trying to perceive the patterns that emerge out of its matrix of art and cultural events. In our text, it was possible to include a range of voices reflecting a spectrum of opinion. But on our cover images, we realized that we had to send out a solid single image that would instantly convey the sense of what we were trying to say in our cover story. If the cover image managed to amuse the reader along the way, that was a bonus. Early in the magazine's life, we realized that unlike the icons which stand in the main town squares in the West, a dispersed city like Bombay has very few architectural symbols that have the same resonance for a wide cross-section of people across classes and ethnic groups. Off the top of your head, you know that if you see the Eiffel Tower on a magazine cover, you're probably going to read about Paris. Or if you see a Statue of Liberty there, it's probably going to be something about New York. But Bombay, as far as we could determine, had only Flora Fountain, the Gateway of India, and the Rajabai clock tower that was sort of instantly recognizable. We tried to put Flora Fountain on the cover a few times, but it looked so generic that not very many people recognized it. I'm a great fan of the openness that the Gateway of India represents. It's a big symbol of welcome for people, and especially in a city like ours, which sort of dangerously veers towards insularity. The Gateway of India, you would think, would be a lovely symbol to put on the cover. But there was a practical problem. It's often too wide to be able to include the gateway area and have text and other symbols. So, as I looked back over the years, I realized that we ended up fitting the Rajabai clock tower onto the cover the maximum number of times, maybe because it's long and thin, and that lets you do a lot of stuff around it. So, this is the Rajabai clock tower. There it is again, in the corner. And here it is again. So is it very rigorous to keep recycling symbols in this way, and it only reiterates a sort of hegemonic representation of Bombay, but sometimes it's the only practical way, it seems, to advertise the bare bones of a story. Okay, we're going down another path now. Oh, yeah, there's more Rajabai Clock. One reporting technique I've attempted to hone in along the years is by identifying the less audible voices in a city by listening to songs and their lyrics. I first began to realize how interesting this could be as a way of telling stories in the mid-1990s when I lived abroad for the first time. New York, I discovered, wasn't just a melting pot city, it was a melting pop city. A great many of the ethnic groups that lived right next to each other were borrowing musical elements from each other and creating new genres that were very uniquely New York. In their lyrics were to be found pretty bold statements of how they saw life in their new home. Almost immediately when I went to New York, I was drawn into a party scene that had been created by a very strange demographic shift. In the 1960s, thousands of middle-class Indians had moved to the States to go to university. And they ended up staying there, even though they all promised to come back after they went to the IIT, and that they would, you're among the exceptions, these engineers who would come and build a brand new India. But they ended up settling in New Jersey and Minneapolis and God knows whatever that is. And 25 years later, in the 1990s, their children, who were my age when I got to New York, about in their 20s, were moving to big American cities to work and study and to create new Indian American identities. They were gathering in places in New York like the Asian American Writers Workshop, where people like Jhumpa Lahiri would soon go on to write quite powerful books about their lives. But the most audible aspect of this attempt to create an Indian American identity was happening in music, reflecting the energy of an earlier scene that had been created in the UK about a decade before that. That was called the Asian Underground. New York's Indian American scene was focused on a club downtown called SOBs, the Sounds of Brazil. But once a month, a DJ called DJ Rekha, who's now been coming to Bombay quite a lot, Rekha Malhotra, was organizing a monthly event there called Basement Bhangra. And a lot of albums were being produced at that time by young guys in Queens with names like Lil J, and this guy, Magic Mike, was actually Mukesh. His big album when I was there, this one was called Choli to the Macarena, which married to the two big hits at that time, Choli ke piche kya hai and Macarena. And both of them were sort of referencing their new lives in their music. Lil J, I'm going to play you a little bit of Lil J sometime. India. 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 Let's get up and dance. India. India. India.
Coming back quick, the needle rings candle, going out warm like a motherfucking candle. A legend, of course, I'm never the same. Retire in style cause you can't contend. Picking up the mic when it's time to go solo. I got more rhymes and I'm going down totally. The little schema. Yes, there is a little J dropping out like the US on Hiroshima. Toast in the turn, I leave the mic burning. When I drop the line, it ain't no returning. Loud and relax, time for some action. When I'm getting paid, when I make the transaction. 96 days, leave the Diamante. I got crazy pops like Carlito and Dante on music. My man, little kid, so leisure. So I know that a little J, even though it's just like a drum.
So you got the idea. That was little Jay, I think his real name was Jayant Mehta or Jayant Patel or something, or Patel. And he was big in New York, because my friend Sumini said did a cover story on him for the New York Times Sunday magazine that was called "Be Young, Hip and Indian." And suddenly the rest of New York was discovering these guys. But in addition to the Desi party scene, I was especially curious about other parts of the South Asian diaspora that had also found themselves in New York. In addition to the 1960s immigrants from India and Pakistan and their second generation children, New York was also home to descendants of Indians who had lived for more than a century in other places like South Africa and Fiji, and especially the West Indies. These people had protected their sense of Indianness, and they've done this for generations, nurturing a very strong sense of what it meant to be South Asian. But they were suddenly being confronted by other parts of the diaspora, especially by people like us, by recent arrivals from the subcontinent, who refused to recognize them as authentically Indian, whatever that means. The strand of the diaspora that especially fascinated me was the Indo-Caribbean community, mainly migrants from Trinidad and Guyana, who lived right by New York's JFK airport, right out at the end of the A line in the district of Queens. They were much more working class than many other South Asian immigrants. And to be honest, their music was much more energetic. Many of them were clustered around a neighborhood called Richmond Hill. And on weeknights, I would go to clubs with names like Calypso City, to have taken the spectacle of gorgeous women spinning with one hand around their back, behind their backs, and the other overturned above their heads. They call these gyrating moves winding, which was a contraction of the word winding. And they danced to bands that played a genre of music that they call chutney. Chutney is characterized by light percussion. There is a joyful electric bass line, and it anchors Indian instruments such as the tasa, the dholak and the tablas, in addition to bongos, congas and a conventional drum set. Riding above these is the compelling clink of a dantal, which is a curved metal rod that is struck with a clapper. I've never seen the dantal played in India, but when I was reading Amitabh Ghosh's book Sea of Poppies, which is about about the strand of the diaspora going away from Bihar and Bhojpur, he speaks of the dantal that they take with them as a digging implement. So clearly this agricultural instrument, by the time it got there, got transformed into a musical instrument. But unlike Indian forms of music, which are melodic, chutney music is harmonic. Chutney performers often have teams of backup vocalists singing in harmony. And they also have saxophones and trumpets, guitars, and the harmonium. Chutney songs mix up Bhojpuri music folk rhythms with West Indian soca pop. And the lyrics often switch between creolized English and Bhojpuri. And this is what it sounds like. This is a song about the birth of chutney.
Today we laugh when we planting rice. You go here, you truck,
pains and the distress of the Indo-Caribbean community's double dislocation. First from India to the Caribbean and then from the Caribbean to America. The tunes mix the language, as you could hear, of the community's Indian heritage with the rhythms of the Caribbean past and their American future. Soon enough, they were producing songs about their new lives in New York. This one, for instance, expresses the anxiety of young Indo-Caribbeans losing their values in the permissive, I think I missed that, so we will get it on the fly. So this is about people losing their values when they come to New York. If it will play, I think it will. So you got the idea of what's happening there. That would be, oh my God. But as they were tending to consolidate their lives in the US, Hinduism was becoming increasingly a part of this definition of self. When I visited a couple of years ago, actually, and I went back to Richmond, and Jagran's and all-night readings of the Ramayana were suddenly becoming very important. And these were things that they hadn't, that don't really exist in the West Indies. And they're being advertised all along the streets. But it was precisely this kind of new religiosity that was exacerbating the tensions between them and the more recent immigrants from India. 1.5 centuries has made Caribbean Hinduism a slightly different creature from its subcontinental counterpart. It's more homogeneous than its Indian variant, and it has less room for ambiguity, as so often happens when things travel. People hold on to it so dearly that they don't allow for any change. So even as things have changed in India, these things have not changed in the West Indies. And as a result, more Indian immigrants refuse to attend religious services in temples in Richmond Hill that are presided over by Indo-Caribbean priests. And there were all of these sources of tension. In the middle of my research in the community towards the end of the 90s, these differences were suddenly rendered meaningless. On the evening, one evening in September 1998, 3 men in white baseball caps set upon a 20-year-old Indo-Caribbean student named Rishi Maharaj and beaten senseless. The police said that these 3 men had been drinking, and they decided that it would be fun to go out and beat some fucking Indians. So despite what the South Asian professionals in Manhattan thought, it became clear that the rest of America saw all of these brown people as one undifferentiated mass of Indians. For a short while, progressives tried to form a coalition of groups of both strands of the diaspora, but that effort didn't go very far. As always, it was left to the more marginal Indo-Caribbeans to make an effort to show that they deserve to be allowed to rub shoulders with Indians. I was fascinated to see how this began to play out in the party scene. So though the kids at DJ Rekha's based in Bhangra parties weren't dancing to chutney, the musicians of the Indo-Caribbean scene were trying to figure out how to edge their way into the scene. And they devised a genre that's still kicking around that's called chutney bhangra.
You don't know, it's all about the soca background. It's all about bunchy and shabby. Ladies on the soca and chutney harmony. What up? That's right. Chop, 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 chop. That's right. So make it loud and shout it.
Okay, so chutney bhangra didn't exactly set the music world afire. But it threw open the possibility to look at new transnational networks that now define cities. Networks in this case that stretch through India, London, Trinidad, Guyana, both in time and in space. And yet chutney bhangra could only have come out of the specific political and cultural circumstances of 1990s New York. Finally, chutney bhangra provided an idea about the strategy that groups use to try to be heard, sometimes even trying to fold their stories into a larger narrative because they think that's the best way of drawing attention to themselves. We still have some time? Okay. A few years after my blunderings into the chutney world, I decided to use a variant of this approach to listen to a city that was both historical and culturally the creation of the imagination of immigration. And I was interested in looking at Bombay in the 1930s. Some of my curiosity about this was drawn because I saw this clip. You've heard it before. It's called Divana Parwana. It's from a film from 1951, from a film called Alvera. Oh, we will try to play it again. Yeah, I just need to show some pictures of this. Yeah. It's a really good yeah, I just need to be able to pull up, let this down, and pull up the power down. Sorry about this. So, when you come to the end of that clip, and you could hear him already, there was a trumpet going in that clip. And you heard it many, many times because it used to go off. And the guy who appears at the end of that clip is this guy, the trumpet player who you see here. His name was Chick Chocolate. And many of you all have heard me blather on about him before because I'm quite obsessed by him. His real name was Antonio Xavier Vaz, but when he came to Bombay, he wanted to become a musician and they decided that Antonio Xavier Vaz was not exactly the hippest name, so he changed it to Chick Chocolate. In the mid-1930s, jazz bands were quite the rage with Bombay's upper crust. And the city had dozens of bands playing this music in hotels and gymkhanas, in railway institutes, and even in the bandstands that you see around Bombay. Chick's physical appearance in that film, you could see his band at the back of those dancers, was quite unusual. But by this point, his involvement with the Hindi film industry and the involvement of other jazz musicians in it was quite the standard practice. By the 1940s, as Hindi film recording techniques had become much more sophisticated, producers began to hire musicians who could play Western instruments for their recording sessions to produce the orchestral sounds that would sound really big in the theaters. And so jazz musicians like this guy who were playing at gymkhanas and things in the night would be playing Hindi film music in the day. And so that's how you have songs like Ina Ina Dika and Mera Naam Chin Chin Choo, things which sound very much like American jazz at the time. And so these jazz musicians occupied a very central space in producing the most popular sound in India at that time. But in their real lives, these guys were actually a fairly marginal presence. Many of them were migrants from Goa, and they lived in lower middle class neighborhoods like Dobitala. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dobitala. But when you walk around Dobitala now in those narrow little lanes, and if you look up, you will see many little signboards saying club of this and club of that. Has anybody ever seen that? Many of these are owned, there are these dormitories that are owned by Goan villages, they're called Cooks. If you go to Kayani's, for instance, you will see that building, Jai Mahal, has many of these, what they call clubs. They're actually in Konkani called Cooks. And they are long rooms where these men would come, this still exists, and they were given space only to keep a trunk. So they had trunks with their stuff in it. In the night, they would take out their bedding, roll it down. In the morning, they roll it up again and go to work. Many of them worked as cooks. The Dobitala was a perfect neighborhood for Goan migrants because Goans, we have always been ABCs, Ayas, butlers and cooks. And so it was near Crawford Market where they could go. Musicians were actually a little embarrassed by this film connection. They saw themselves mainly as Western musicians who played jazz and all of these fancy things. And so they rationalized their excursions into the Hindi film studios merely as a way of making a living or trying to supplement their income. Few of them actually went to see the movies they produced, that they had featured in. And many of them even forgot the titles of the movies in which they had appeared. And yet, even though they didn't feel that they wanted to talk about this, they had a ringside view of the process by which movies were being made. And their hotel jobs, they witnessed significant events taking place. When I interviewed them, this offered an intriguing sideways vision of the world. For instance, some of these men who played at the Taj in the jazz bands in the 1930s actually ended up providing the background scores for the deliberation of several of the parties in the independence struggle. The Chamber of Princes, which was the forum that had been established in 1921 to allow the rulers of princely states to convey their demands to the British, They met frequently at the Taj. They had a special room called the Prince's Room to discuss their vision of independent India. Sarojini Naidu kept a permanent suite at the hotel that served both as a high society salon and also as the Congress Party boardroom. Sarojini Naidu's rooms also provided a refuge for Rakti Jinnah, the wife of Pakistan's founder Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who would frequently squabble with her husband and then retreat to Sarojini Naidu's rooms to take refuge from her husband. Mahatma Gandhi once visited the Taj to address a group of European businessmen. And on August 14, 1947, as Nehru was ascending the podium of the Constituent Assembly in Delhi to address the nation, his sister Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit was in the Taj in Bombay along with J.R.D. Tata and a journalist called D.F. Karaka. Karaka gave a stirring speech, after which the jazz musicians on the stage, these guys, performed Jana Gana Mana. It was, in some of these musicians' stories, the proudest moment of their lives. In this case, though there were no lyrics to listen to, the texture of the music spoke for itself, as did these strangely paradoxical visuals in the song sequences, in which the musicians played a central role in creating the sound, but they would appear only as fleeting visions in the background. I was fascinated by this period of Bombay music and by this part of film history. To begin with, this was world music being created in the film studios every day, long before the term world music had actually been invented. But in addition, this music echoed the dreams of newly independent India. Everyday Hindu composers and Muslim lyricists and Roman Catholic musicians were sitting together, demonstrating through music that it was actually possible to find a way to bridge all our differences. At its heart, then, this music was to me the most suitable metaphor for the way in which Bombay was conducting itself during that period. At the end of all of these images and tunes, I'd like to return to the twinkies I started with at the beginning. All of us who write about cities, I think, would love to construct neat narratives that are smooth as the cream filling inside that golden sponge cake. But cities, we learn all to our peril, are too ungainly and energetic and diverse to allow a homogeneous approach to writing about them. The modern city, fragmented on class and caste lines, and sometimes connected more strongly to urban networks on other continents than to the hinterland from which they have sprung, simply can't be contained in a single story. Our challenge, I think, is to find ways to listen to these stories from the stage wings and from the edges, hoping that all of these little melodies will eventually give us a larger sense of the symphony of the city. Thanks.
We should take some questions.
Of course.
Or comments.
Please don't throw tomatoes.
What you started on wanting to talk about the subjects. What was your journey on wanting to? You said you given some examples of what was your fascination that brought you to this.
So, everybody in my family played music and I cannot. I'm awful. I just cannot play an instrument. And so I'm fascinated by people who can play music, play proficiently and play creatively. So I think this sort of just stems from my great inadequacy and my admiration for people who sort of perform an art form I really love and I'm completely unable to grapple with myself.
Why cities? This whole interpolation of cities and music.
So I told you about music. So the thing is, to do sort of sophisticated journalism, I think you really need to be, you need to have great awareness about the things around you. And you need to constantly be revisiting things. You have to know a place's history. You have to know how every new event adds up to something. I live in a city, and so I'm sort of stuck writing about this stuff because I don't have the money to go away to the Northeast and spend 4 years researching a book. So just circumstance requires me to poke my head out of the window and write about the things that are happening. And I'm just blessed with having the opportunity to live in this city where every great international sort of force is playing through. Religious fundamentalism, deindustrialization, financialization, speculation, all of these new economic changes. People from around the world come here to study us. So I think sort of we owe to ourselves to also figure out what's happening from our point of view.
Just kind of curious to know more about that racial tension that happened in New York and how it brought about, like I'm sure a lot of other things have happened, would have happened along with, mechanical people wanting to make a presence in more of the mainstream media, let's say, and talking about some reflected in other spheres also about this merging of the communities and how, like, why was the response to merge in New York and in Bombay, whereas talking about more globalization?
That's an interesting question. I think perhaps because their numbers are relatively small within a large sort of community. So I imagine the analogy for that would be in Bombay. Bombay's Muslim community there are many different kinds of Muslims, Shia, Sunnis being the broadest divisions and then all of that. And yet in your response to crisis, you present a coherent identity. And I imagine that was happening in New York too. So in Bombay we don't think of Muslims in terms of the many subgroups, though that's when you walk to Mendi Bazaar, you sort of, or other Muslim neighborhoods, you see just sort of all the various things. Bombay is now actually playing out in some quite acute way with the Mendi Bazaar redevelopment, because that is a project that is being driven by the Boris. But about 10% of the people who live there are actually from other Muslim groups. And they accuse the Boris of steamrolling them and throwing them out of this. And so, the fault lines are there. If you want to, I think sort of they present themselves in different occasions and in different circumstances.
Do you ever get a suspicion that this inclination towards urbanization the world over, in the sense of a collective species decision, is a little off or something? Or do you think, what do you say about that?
It's not a collective decision. It's it's an economic decision that is driven by a few people who benefit from this. So, we've been sold this idea that India is urbanizing. India is being urbanized because the new economic model makes it very difficult to live in the countryside. People are being impoverished. Agriculture is increasingly being rendered a futile activity. And so people have no option then but to come to cities. And there's a real paradox with this way we talk about urbanization, because all the people who drive the economy say, we need to be urban. And yet, as we drive people off, we're doing nothing to offer people a dignified life in cities. If we need to be urban, we should be building large-scale housing for migrants. But we don't. And so, the paradox of this, the hypocrisy of this is really clear. And we're not handling urbanization very well. They speak again, the other thing that Modi speaks of, we need 100 new cities, which is a completely ahistorical thing. Cities don't just emerge because you want them to emerge. They're the accretion of historical and social forces. And a really good example of this, I think, is New Bombay, which was built, it started to emerge in the 1970s and didn't really take off until 40 years later, when it had a reason to exist, when work moved there, when the train line allowed it to be linked to Bombay. And this has happened in many other places. Gurgaon doesn't have a life of its own. It's got a life only because it's a satellite of Delhi. Fatehpur Sikri actually and Daulatabad are good examples of how you, in history, you want to build new cities and you can't because they have no reason to exist and then they have no water and all of these things, so they die.
And in a personal sense, has there been a space for escape for you from the city?
You know, I don't want to leave cities.
You're quite comfortable.
I'm not comfortable. I'm constantly raving about how terrible they are. But they give me so much to write about.
No, but if you would leave Bombay, for instance, what would be the one thing or the one many things that you would, what would you really miss about Bombay?
See, for me, Bombay is a network of relationships that have, so my family, one part of my family has been in Bombay since 1947, they came from Karachi. Another part of my family has always lived in Bandra. My grandfather used to own a farm in Bandra. And so this dense network of relationships is impossible to escape. And I don't want to escape it. In some way it's stifling, in some way it's quite enlivening.
I'd like to share something. I'm sure all of you have experienced it. I lived all my life in Mathura. I'm sure everybody has some connection to Mathura that I've found in my life in some ways studying or something. And Mathura was known as a mini Varanasi. Even if you do research on it, you go to Mathura today, it's 90% Kachis or Jains or Gujaratis. So there's been a complete shift of all the existing territories of South India. And the reason Mathura has the charm is South Indians being South Indians are the disciplinarians and the gardens are perfect and etc. So you have the people who created the culture just moving out. They've offered huge amount of money to move out. And I also moved out to a place called Goregaon. And then you see all the entire people from Mathura moved out to Goregaon. Okay? So the last 10 years it was okay, fine, I just moved to another country. And now, Goregaon was being redeveloped and all the original South Indians who moved from Mathura to Goregaon are shifting, I don't know where. But, so there is this whole transition happening of communities completely moving because the culture is changing in that direction. Today, interestingly, my office is here in Mathura, as I go there, you have these, Mathura has South Indian temples. So these entire foreigners standing and looking at these temples. It's in 20 years, 30 years, I've never seen Mathura being a spot for people to tour. Why on earth? And then I realized, why? Because they're all going to visit Haran, where there's a slum tourism. So, you have slum tourism. And they go to the Kachhi with the entire huge, the most conspicuous, of richness over there. And you just wonder what space are you living in over there. It's such a fascinating thing when you see changes that are happening, people around. It's worth a visit if you haven't gone there recently. Complete change.
The process you're talking about is actually so historical. So neighborhoods, especially like Vileparle, a lot of Maharashtrians from Girgaon moved to Vileparle and created, which is why, and so people have always been moving in groups. My part of Bangalore, people moved from Kotachiwadi, for instance. And so groups have always been moving further down the spine and complaining about how they've been taken over by other people. But this throws up quite interesting conundrums. So for instance, and I'm going to speak now out of my experience from I was recently, the Roman Catholic Church every 5 years does what they call a consultation, where they discuss the matters of the lay people and figure out how best they can be served. So because of the historical development of this, now all of the Roman Catholic institutions and schools, the biggest ones are in South Bombay up to Bangalore. But the populations have actually moved to Malad and Burubli and Mira. Those people are very badly served. But you have so for instance, there's a wonderful church in Maikala called Gloria Church, which is it's got huge spires. And there are about 4,000 people in that parish now. So they can't afford to keep up that church, which is crumbling. But they don't know what to do with it. The churches in Kolaba are even more sparsely attended. Everybody's grappling with this in various different ways.
Yeah, Naresh, I just want to, you spoke about this music thing. There's this place in Novitala, Bangalore, between those coffee shops. It's a small bowl,
C. Roberts.
which is the only one which plays music to the coffee carts. Like you can go stand there and listen to it over chat. But there are not many places like in New York and London now. You have these guys just playing street music and they're allowed to play for money or it just breaks the already. So was that those things in Mumbai before or?
See, in Mumbai we had a big tradition of fellows playing on the train.
Yeah.
But the train is now got so crowded. You can barely walk, stay disappear. Which is weird. Otherwise, you have those kids who bang the stone, where the guys playing the harmonium, that's all gone. And I think
Used to have bands. I got to know we used to have
Yeah.
bands.
the police bands and all those came to those places. And now they've tried to revive those traditions. But the tradition of busking, in my neighborhood for instance, every now and then at dusk, a voice appears playing a harmonium. There's a character in the neighborhood who's called Chutney Mary. And Chutney Mary is actually the name given to the same, to different people over the years. If you've seen the news Midnight's Children, the movie, there's a character based on Chutney Mary who comes and sings English songs. You are my sunshine, all of these things. But over the years, does not remember a single word. So it's all gibberish, but to these melodies. And I thought that this was a phenomenon only in my neighborhood, and I was talking about it once. At a meeting at Tama. And about 5 other people said, no, this happens in my neighborhood too. So then we tried to catch hold of this person who everybody knew as Chutney Mary. And we realized there are many variations of Chutney Mary, none of whom know the words of these songs. They don't even know English, but they sing, You Are My Sunshine, Irene, Good Night. They sing only the first line and then they say, wow. So there's still a little stuff. In Dadar and all of these, there are also sort of, in Shivaji Park, there are singers who come in the evening. But again, like many street hawkers, because now we all live in very tall buildings and we've all enclosed our balconies, you can't hear these people anymore. So that's one of the problems, is that you can't sing up to the 20th floor. I don't know, and again in my neighborhood, when the vegetable vendor came around, we would lower a little bag with the money, then put the vegetables in. Now again, we've gone too high to be able to do that.
But it's also the reason you can have it in the New York and the London and stuff is because the city has a policy of making it possible. One of the biggest problems in cities like Bombay, I see the old bands and stuff that you talk about in cities like Bombay and Delhi, there was I don't know the details of it, but I know there were government backing to have that kind of stuff happen. And so the public places and parks were made available. Today, if we want to present a show, say at Municipal Garden, we will probably have to go to different shows. We will never get the full list of the licenses that are necessary, and the cost will be prohibitive, and the time will be prohibitive. So, unfortunately, for instance, if you go to Delhi Nehru Park, right? They've got a logic of having open air performances, and every winter in Delhi you have fantastic performances happening in Nehru Park where the public goes in huge roads, and it's available to everybody. So a lot of it also depends on how the city views itself. And I was in the States for 12 years, and I think for me one of the saddest things about coming back to India is we don't really take from them what makes their cities rich. We have an idea of what makes the US, and the idea is financial and weird kind of infrastructure. Like roads, that is not. So in the US, you can go to lots of cities and a lot of them are completely crappy, and you just go to Houston, it's concrete and there's no trees, and you feel like you're getting claustrophobic because I'm great, but managed to have a really good well-paying job that makes you live in luxury there. It's really tough to be there. But if you go to New York, which is the city that even the Indians who go out and come back and celebrate, New York is great because it has all this. It has the finances and it has all the other stuff set up, but what it has is a city that actively allows or does public spaces for people where all this stuff can happen. And you have busking because there are laws. You can't just go busk by the way in a metro station. You have to actually go and be allowed to do it. You have to take a spot.
But the space in Barcelona, where actually we've been there, it's just an open space, it's an empty space.
Yeah.
You can just go with your instrument, sit there, and just keep playing, and you can just listen. It's not begging, it's just,
Yeah, absolutely.
you can just express yourself and just
Absolutely.
walk
But
out.
those are designated spaces. The
Yeah.
city has said you can do this. And then there is an unwritten protocol amongst people. So even graffiti, there's an unwritten protocol about how it can happen. And there is it's something that cities allow, you put it that way, right? I don't know about other cities, but I sense in India that I don't know, I just sense in India that the government doesn't trust the people and vice versa, and therefore you will never allow anything because obviously they will only vandalize and destroy things, right? And it's really a tragedy in a sense because then you don't actually create the safety of people. It's one of the reasons that we think it's really important to have.
Like this, the shop in Metro, and I was very tired. I was just walking past it. I was really tired, but I do a lot of it. When I went through this and listened to this gold news, after 2 minutes, my walking speed actually increased. In fact, like I was like, I was just getting that. It was happening at a very subconscious level, but it just kind of peps you up.
It energizes you, yeah. It lets you breathe. It takes your head away from something else and gives you the rest of it. I don't know why we don't have public art. We don't have, I mean,
Well, I happen to be there for this screening which Anand Tatwar is there to have the theatre and
No.
very nice. Not really lovely space.
So this is weird thing about.
but it's a sensitive group. You see what's happening, what's interesting for me is what's interesting for me, what's happening in Bombay, and I'm really glad it's happening, is that I think we don't have a meeting in government. And so in places like Bandra, we have very strong citizens groups who look after the physical life of that area, but they also contribute to the life of that space. And they've gone and made their connections to the police and to the local government and whatever, and they've kept the relationships going. And therefore, there you have this stuff happen. And you have it, I mean, it just saves the life.
So President represents about public art. Recently the new airport opened and they say that they have the largest collection of public art in India. Which is an absurd idea because it's not public. You have to find anything to go there. And nobody is going to all their
And
money.
they want us to go and say, is there public art? Let us
But it really sort of emphasizes to me how we've forgotten what the notion of public art.
Junoon Local there.
No, only the public is allowed it. No? That's the
But we are kind of reclaiming our spaces, don't you think? Like with all these street plays which are happening, and those groups of mood, I forget what they're called. People are just dancing on their own,
the
flash mobs. So people are trying to kind of reclaim it even for an instant. But it's happening, it never used to happen before.
I think that people, my sense like we talked to, we met a person in the first flash mob in Bombay, this young, quite extraordinary young girl. So I think I was great, you would have known, I can't believe she did it, right? But you should have a story about, she just has a way, she can convince any of us to do anything.
Because they got commissions and all of
Yeah,
that.
so the kind of work
Yeah.
to get this crazy, honestly, and all that the music you're talking about, it's people like us. Really, if you had a group of absolutely poor people, not like us, somebody get up and take up space and start music, what would our real reaction? Even our local garden, okay, and people, your maids, 20 of the maids came down to your garden and started, singing a song. What would our reaction be? Would we really be as enthusiastic as we see right now? We would say this is noise, it's pure. What would be our
I mean,
reaction?
one of the constant complaints about people is that the slum next door, they have a loudspeaker that's going to play. They're playing
So if there is someone, Maharashtrians, a lot of them transfer now years, they are cultural. For us, it's not something that we like to make.
In Bombay now, depending on what figures you believe, somewhere between 60 to 90% of jobs are informal. That means that, these are contract, you could be thrown out at any moment, they don't have benefits. And even so, now all jobs in journalism are actually jobs of contract, they are informal jobs. They are renewed from year to year. Security, I always like to look at this how in the old Bombay you had a Nepali security guard. And you took care of him and then he went to the village and he bought his brother and you paid. Now you have a system of security agencies, of Biharis who are paid 4,500 rupees. They change every month because that guy actually doesn't pay them and so they go back to their village. And we are less secure because they don't know who you are and they have no incentive to actually do their job. But the sort of, the informalization plays, everybody's responsible for it. It seems less of a hassle. but it's really impinging on the kind of city we are. We're a much more anxious city. Everybody doesn't know whether they'll have a job day after tomorrow. And of course, this is being celebrated. As you know, you have to be adaptable. If you can't adapt to the economy in a new economy, if you're not entrepreneurial, it's your fault. So, I mean, this leads me to another of my pet rhymes, which I'm not going to.
You have 5 minutes to run.
Okay, 5 minutes to rhyme. Which is this whole sort of romanticization of Dharavi that's emerged. And so now every week we will have a sort of film or an article talking about Dharavi's entrepreneurial energy. They always tell us that their GDP there is $500 million, and they produce all of these things. A woman called Rashmi Bansal has produced a self-help book called Poor Little Rich Slum, and she says, if Dharavi can do it, why can't you? And it really creates this rationalization to say, we don't have to care about the way our drivers and our cooks live, because they are so productive, and that's all that really matters. And this is a complete bizarre inversion of values here.
You have your book here. You can buy a book.
Oh, sorry.
We'll send you a link. Yeah, exactly. And you can buy it from
Flipkart.
That's what I think.
Crossword.
You can learn a lot from our guest also. Sorry. You did that crossword at the bottom.
Crossword.
Oh, yeah.
Great work. Thank you for listening patiently.
Thank you.
Thanks, Naresh. Can I just, me being the eternal optimist, can I request you to just give, the last 2 lines with some optimism and hopefulness?
She's clearly a very
And I'm optimistic, it's almost dinner time.
Well, thank you so much, Naresh. Thank you for, I think the fascinating thing is that I think at Junoon we read your book, City Adrift, and to hear it in your voice was really quite lovely. I know you took a lot from your other book, which is I think Taj Mahal Foxtrot, and again we'll send you the links. To help us do that, please fill in this little blue slip over here that gives us your mail details. And also do pick up this membership card, and there's this little lovely red stamp that you'll get on it. And if you get 12 of these lovely red stamps in a year, we have a special session for you, which we'll
surprise
a special something. Yeah. And also Mumbai Local is a program that that spreads because of you and because of your experience. So if you liked what you experienced over here, please spread the word. There are several ways you can do that. Please pick up one of these on your way out and put it up somewhere in your building, in your college. Hand it out to some people you know who would be interested. And next time when you come, please bring a friend with you, otherwise you won't let you in. And so do spread the word. Also follow us on Facebook /Junoon Theatre, Twitter /Junoon Theatre. If you'd like to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag Mumbai Local Arts. That's a lot of information. I'll also email you. And hope to see you soon. We're at 4 venues. So do pick up Naresh's book at Kitab Khana, where we're also there on the 3rd Friday of the month. So don't wait that long, but do come to Kitab Khana. And we're also there at the Howrah Chilad Museum and in Enfield, Bangalore. So till the next time we meet.
And our next session here is?
Our next session here is by Manoj Joshi, and we'll be speaking about Chanakya and the certain character about his play. So it will be a delightful session. Please do come. That will be on the 4th Friday of April, which is the 25th of April, again 5:30 p.m. right here. So thank you.
I think there is the complexity in Mumbai. I don't think that's true. I think every city has a problem, and you always have class issues. America might say they have class issues, but they are serious class issues. That's not the issue. The issue is, what do you validate? Really, what do you validate? If a city says, if a city says public spaces to engage with the arts should be available, and we're going to do everything to have it happen, and it says these groups come and say, we want to do this, and then other groups say, we want to come and do this, the city says, okay, there's the parking, right? The city has validated it. Then you have some tensions. I'm sure you have tensions in the US also. I'm sure you have tensions in non-coms. I'm sure people say, we don't want those people there. That's human. It happens. But here the problem is that the city itself doesn't help you. So for instance, there's a group called the National, to answer your busking question, there's a group called the National Streets of Performing Arts who love the busking area and they love music and they start with music and they want the places where crowds of people go to have music in them. So they are right now working across the Western Railway lines. They've tied up with the railways. They've got permission and they are every morning, certain days of the week, morning and evening, if you go to Bangalore station or railway station or whatever, they are playing there. You go talk to them, very really dedicated, committed group of people who are, this is the beginning of the idea, but their design is not happened. They've got a vision. One of their biggest jobs, they tie up the railways. It's only one government agency. The railways can say yes, we do. Every month, they have to fill, in that same railway office, they have to run on them to get permission for the next month. Every month. Right, so one part of that team is dedicated to just getting permissions from an organization that has already agreed it's a good idea. I mean, you're really working. Why are we here and not on public parking? Why are we looking for venues where public can come in? I mean, why is Mumbai Local working this way? We are coming to venues in school and we are saying as long as you're not public in, we'll do in your school. And why are we finding these kinds of avenues? Because it's not a public here. It's really, I mean, why are we in Bhadaji Ghat Museum and not any museum? Because Bhadaji Ghat Museum has had somebody who's had the ability to push things. And then it's really, it needs more and more people to demand it. My sense in this city, it needs more and more people to say collectively that this has to happen. And somehow we don't see it in this. I don't know, we don't see it in here. It almost surprises me that this, we will very proudly say we have 2,000 year old culture. We have 2,500 years of unbroken culture. We have this, we have that. But not one of us will do anything to preserve and nurture culture. And I'm using the word nurture because it's not about dead culture. It's about keeping it living. And somewhere we are very proud to say we have that culture, but we don't see that we have to actively nurture it. When you're talking about histories, right? When you're talking right about the Ramasan, I'm just thinking that in the US, which has no history because it's such a young country, you go everywhere and it's all set up. And they tell you this like 550-year-old history. Right? And then we just take history so much for granted that why are they there? I don't know what it is. Like why aren't they? You should do walks. You really would be fascinating. Like you interview people who go around the city and have your stories to tell. And the way you approach the city which is not academic in that sense, so it's accessible for us. I just wish that you end up in Chicago has walks around this architecture. You know, they're proud, and I don't know what it is about us that doesn't allow. We have a huge pride in the city of Bombay, but somehow as a city, I don't know. You know? And so this is my very long points, but it's inspiring aspects here. We are so much with the basics, being to read somewhere, struggling for jobs, the time space that we have left. We have so many energies to bring somewhere else. So, I think most of the people get lost in that daily struggle. And that's a good agenda of the government. Keep us busy with the daily struggle. We got to have a lot of time. Just take it out. That's the only way to go. Sorry? I'm saying we got to allot a certain amount of time to something that we believe in. Because otherwise you just get like too involved in the daily grind. Unless you decide that I want to put in this much time for this thing which is important to me. So, like, I'm a mom of many young kids and it's very difficult for me to even come and for an hour out here, but this is important to me. So I do want to come here and I think it's like very, very find what's important. Thanks for tuning in. Let's have one more question. It's interesting to me that you kept saying in your talk today that you want to listen to the North Center voices. And you kept saying that, and of course, in your talk, you shared with us the voices that you took us through were the music voices. I also hear a nostalgia for a certain vision of India, which is right, which is a vision of India that says we can actually come together, which that becomes the force of it. But what do you think is happening with the narrative of the city that you place yourself against? You know what I'm saying? What do you think is, yeah?
I mean, so like I keep saying, one of the problems is now on all the hoardings as you go through Bombay for new developments, they're also exclusive. And that was never the Bombay ambition. Bombay ambition was always inclusivity. Even if we had divisions, you work towards a goal that said that recognized that we share spaces. So, I mean, like I keep pointing out, in Bombay, the one thing that the Hindi film celebrated was Marine Drive. That was the most iconic Bombay site you could get in a film. It wasn't the Taj, it wasn't, J.R.B. Tata's house. In fact, most people don't even know where J.R.B. Tata is. It was that, it was, and occasionally you would cut to, Kamala Nehru Park. It was these spaces that were truly public. And now we are sort of eroding these spaces, the physical spaces. I mean, we need to look at Marine Drive to see how now when you get out of Charlie Road station, you can't actually cross the road and go to Marine Drive. You have to go 100 meters down, climb over, and then get back. The Oval is a great example of these middle class groups that have restored the Oval, but they put up such a huge fence around it, it can actually be accessed only at one point. And you would think that, and the pavement by it is really narrow. The bulk of the people who should be using it are people coming from Nariman Point, going to the station, but you can't do that. And so we have this really bizarre notion of, what the public facility should be like. Older places like Shivaji Park, for instance, is a perfect example of how you have a low, narrow wall around it. People walk, people sit. All the South Bombay Mallas could actually be like that. But this new vision of the city is about creating grass museums, not about creating spaces that are living.
No space, not even gardens to take your children.
Yeah.
Unless you pay a hefty price to stay in like one of those complexes which have its own playground.
So the municipal corporation has a budget of 27,000 crores every year. The Bombay Municipal Corporation is so rich, it has reserves of 27,000 crores. Their exact budget is sitting in their bank because they can't spend it. And yet, they have said that they don't have the money to keep up these gardens. So they have a policy where they will give it to a sponsor, to a builder, for instance, who can build on 20% of your public park because they claim they don't have the money to do it. It's completely absurd and nobody calls them out on this.
Can't you RTI something like that?
Right?
Yeah, we can demand that.
And everybody knows this.
That's not the shape.
It's just
open secret, huh?
It's not a secret. It's in their books. It's a policy. But nobody has challenged the policy to say, these are your cash reserves. How can you claim you don't have the money to keep these gardens in the state? One of the other problems since we're doing about gardens, and I was talking 2 minutes, is this damn nani parkification of Bombay. So everything has been turned into some concrete walking track. But there are no playgrounds, and playgrounds are important. My father is the chairman of one of the citizens groups in Bangalore that is maintaining a playground. And people call him at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to say there are children making noise. My father says it's a playground, children making noise. But everything now we want to sanitize. We want to put neat little turf, concrete wall, and so this makes our city less vibrant.
I think it's very interesting thing actually MET in Bandra, how it is actually meant for public.
Yeah, they
place.
made it over.
But I was talking to some of those, kind of the shop. I said, why don't see any of these slum people playing that? And I said, no, the jayega to, grass is green, everybody comes in white and crisp. You don't really match with them, So they have actually treated this, if not the physical strain, but
So they have to use the physical distance. So they put up.
Yeah, fence also.
They put up a fence so you can't access it from the sort of middle class people can access it, but the slum kids can't.
And the purpose they keep a security, I would not ask anything, but look very slum kids are really like some, they don't express themselves there, so they don't go to play there. They can't give parties, they're not like.
You can also see this in the Bangalore has 3 promenades. The one that is by Mahim Creek is actually in complete disrepair, and they haven't begun to repair it because, again, there are some people in the reclamation who use it, but it's mainly slum kids, and why the hell should we bother about that?
I'm a PR consultant and we were waiting for a school, and there was a the other things. So it was in a bad shape. So it's okay, as part of the CSR activity, we take over the entire city. And we had an entire plan. We said we get musicians, the budget was given, we get musicians and let musicians play. And it will be open for all the locality to come and listen to the music. We had senior citizens group protests, we had local area people protests, we had politicians come and protest, we had letters going to the police station, they are taking over the garden. So, they're not taking over the garden. Twice a week, Saturday and Sunday, when the schools will be closed, none of us are going to be there. We're opening it up, we do it, we take care of the garden, do everything, be a sponsor for the music. If there's a local person who wants to play the music, they can do theatre, children can do theatre, be a sponsor of everything. Finally, the local municipal partners. So I said, can you please not do this because they'll be getting pressure from everybody to stop you. So okay, fair enough, we won't do it. So there are times when even if communities want to, there's so much political games being played now. And it's assumed that you're doing it for the wrong reason. So in spite of getting all permissions, everything, so once or twice when these things happen, even the local authorities says, "Kaun catch mein padega." You'll have to answer all these groups also. Let's not do it.
Do you think that change, like Mumbai used to be an industrial city, right? I mean, the mills were the big, and in fact, a lot of like so many points in the last conference we came on the student stage, he talked about how the fact that you had it was working class city and you had people coming from all over the country gave Mumbai a certain flavor, which was also a flavor of a certain kind of equal sharing because your work friendly. Do you think the shift of Bombay away from that is also part of the
Definitely. So the new economy now defines us, and so